I'm 78 years old now, and for 41 years I have carried scientific proof that would reshape everything humanity believes about our place on this planet. In the spring of 1984, working as a wildlife biologist for the United States Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest, I was handed 3 unmarked vials containing tissue samples that would destroy my career, consume my life, and eventually lead me to spend the next 4 decades protecting the very creatures whose existence I was ordered to deny. My name is Dr. Walter Brennan, and what I am about to tell you has been classified by the federal government since Ronald Reagan's first term. The men who silenced me are mostly dead now. The agency that threatened my family has been restructured 3 times over, and I am old enough that I no longer fear the consequences of speaking the truth. This is the story of what I found in those samples, what I saw with my own eyes in the deep forests of the Cascade Range, and why I believe humanity is not ready for the knowledge that has been systematically hidden from them for over half a century. I never intended to become a keeper of impossible secrets. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, the son of a paper mill worker and a school teacher. My father worked double shifts most of my childhood, coming home smelling of wood pulp and industrial chemicals, his hands rough and cracked from the labor. My mother instilled in me a love of books and learning, reading to me every night from encyclopedias and nature guides until I could recite the genus and species of every bird in the Great Lakes region. By the time I was 12, I knew I wanted to study animals, to understand the natural world in a way my parents' generation never had the opportunity to explore. I attended the University of Minnesota on a scholarship, graduating in 1968 with a degree in zoology. Vietnam was raging, and I received my draft notice 3 weeks after commencement. I served 2 years as a medical corpsman, stationed at a field hospital in Da Nang, watching young men die from wounds that should have been survivable if only we'd had better resources. When I returned home in 1970, I was a different person. The forests of Minnesota, the quiet lakes and pine-scented air of my childhood became my sanctuary. I enrolled in graduate school at Oregon State University, pursuing a doctorate in wildlife biology with a focus on large mammal population dynamics. I met my wife, Eleanor, in the library stacks in 1972. She was studying botany, cataloging moss specimens from the coastal ranges. We married in 1974, the same year I completed my dissertation on black bear migration patterns in the Cascade ecosystem. The Forest Service hired me that fall, and we moved to a small house outside of Packwood, Washington, population 1,200, nestled in the shadow of Mount Rainier. Eleanor took a position with the State Agricultural Extension Office, and we settled into the quiet rhythm of rural Pacific Northwest life. Those early years were good ones. Simple. I spent my days tracking wildlife populations, collecting scat samples, setting up camera traps that used actual film because digital technology was still decades away. I documented cougar territories, monitored elk herds, and filed reports that nobody in Washington, D.C. ever read. The work was unglamorous but satisfying. I was doing what I'd always wanted to do, studying the natural world, contributing in my small way to its preservation. I had no idea that everything was about to change. The morning of April 14th, 1984, started like any other. I remember the date precisely because it was a Saturday, and Eleanor had asked me to help her plant tomatoes in our garden that afternoon. I'd agreed, planning to spend the morning catching up on paperwork at the Packwood Ranger Station. The spring thaw had come early that year, and the forests were already showing signs of new growth. Prince was on the radio singing about purple rain, and I remember thinking the song was strange but catchy as I drove my government-issued Chevy pickup along the winding forest roads. When I arrived at the station, my supervisor, a man named Harold Jennings, who'd been with the Forest Service since the Kennedy administration, was waiting for me with an expression I'd never seen on his weathered face. Something between excitement and fear, like a man who just witnessed a miracle he wasn't sure was divine or demonic. "Walt," he said, "we need to talk in private." Harold led me to his office and closed the door, something he never did. The station was small, just 4 of us assigned to that district, and privacy was a formality we rarely observed. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small cooler, the kind you'd use to transport insulin or vaccines, and set it on the desk between us. 3 days ago, a logging crew working the Gifford Pin Show found something, Harold began. His voice was lower than normal, almost a whisper. They were clearing brush about 15 miles northeast of here, deep in old-growth territory. One of their bulldozers uncovered what they thought was a shallow grave. They called it in, thinking they'd found a murder victim. County sheriff went out, took one look, and called us. "What was it?" I asked, though something in Harold's demeanor told me the answer would not be simple. Harold opened the cooler. Inside, packed in ice, were 3 sealed glass vials. Each one contained a small amount of tissue, dark and partially decomposed, but clearly biological in origin. "Tissue samples," Harold said. "Taken from a body the sheriff found buried under about 2 feet of soil and forest debris. The body was gone by the time our people arrived the next morning, dug up and removed. But the sheriff had already taken these samples and photographed the scene." Gone? How does a body disappear overnight? Harold reached into his desk again and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were photographs. Polaroids mostly, slightly blurry, but clear enough to make out the subject matter. My breath caught in my throat. The photographs showed a massive figure lying in a shallow depression in the earth. It was covered in dark hair, matted and dirty, but unmistakably not human. The body was at least 8 feet long, with arms that seemed disproportionately longer than any human's, hands that looked like enormous leathery mitts. The face was partially obscured by soil, but I could make out a heavy brow ridge, a broad, flat nose, and what appeared to be closed eyes set deep in the skull. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "The sheriff took these?" "He did." And then he called his brother-in-law, who works for the county commissioner, who called the state police, who called somebody in Olympia, who apparently called somebody in D.C. Harold's jaw tightened. By the next morning, there were federal agents crawling all over that logging site. They confiscated the sheriff's camera, his notes, everything. But his deputy had already developed these Polaroids at home, and the sheriff had already dropped off these tissue samples at my house, asking me to keep them safe until he could figure out what the hell was going on. "Why you?" I asked. Because he knew I'd been with the Forest Service for 30 years, and he trusted me more than whoever those federal people were. Harold pushed the vials toward me. "Walt, I need you to analyze these samples, quietly, off the books. If what I think this turns out to be real, we need scientific proof before those government bastards make it all disappear." I stared at the vials, my mind racing. I was a wildlife biologist, not a forensic scientist. But I had access to laboratory equipment at the Oregon State Extension Facility, and I knew people in the genetics department who owed me favors. More importantly, I understood what Harold was really asking. He wanted me to confirm or deny the existence of something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that, if real, would change everything. I took the samples home that afternoon, telling Eleanor I had some urgent work that couldn't wait. She knew better than to press me for details when I used that tone. I'd learned it in Vietnam, the voice you use when you're carrying something too heavy to share. The next 3 weeks exist in my memory as a blur of sleepless nights and obsessive analysis. I drove to Corvallis 4 times, using the university lab after hours when no one would ask questions. I ran every test I could think of with the equipment available to me: blood typing, cellular structure analysis, preliminary protein sequencing, using techniques that were still relatively new in 1984. With each result, my certainty grew, and with it, my terror. The tissue samples were primate. That much was clear from the cellular structure. But they weren't human, and they weren't any great ape species in the scientific literature. The cells were larger than human cells, with mitochondrial structures I'd never seen described in any textbook. The protein sequences were close to human, startlingly close, but with variations that suggested a divergence point somewhere between 2 and 5 million years ago. If my analysis was correct, these samples came from a creature that shared a common ancestor with Homo sapiens, but had evolved along a completely separate path, a parallel branch of the primate family tree that had somehow survived into the modern era, hidden in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. On May 8, 1984, I presented my findings to Harold in the same small office where this had all begun. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each data point I shared. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Walt, I've worked in these forests for 32 years. I've seen things I couldn't explain. Tracks too big to be bare, structures built from branches that no animal I know of could construct. Shadows moving through the trees at night that didn't move like any wildlife I've ever studied. I always told myself there had to be rational explanations." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Now I'm not so sure there are. I need to tell someone," I said. "This discovery, if it's real, it's the most significant finding in the history of biology. We can't just sit on it." Harold shook his head slowly. "You're not understanding me, Walt. Those federal agents who showed up at the logging site? They weren't FBI. They weren't any agency I recognized. They had credentials, sure, but the kind that don't get questioned, the kind that make local law enforcement step aside without argument. Whatever this is, somebody already knows about it, and they've been keeping it quiet for a long time." I didn't believe him, or rather, I didn't want to believe him. I was a scientist, trained to follow evidence and share findings with the academic community. The idea of government cover-ups and secret agencies felt like paranoid fantasy, the stuff of late-night radio shows and tabloid newspapers. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I reached out to a colleague at the University of Washington, a geneticist named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who had been doing groundbreaking work in DNA analysis. I sent her a portion of one of the tissue samples, along with my preliminary findings, asking for her independent verification. Her response came 2 weeks later, not by mail or phone, but in person. Patricia showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in late May, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she handed me back the sample vial, now empty. "Walt," she said, "what did you send me? You know what I sent you. I need to know where you got it." "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Because I ran every test I could think of. I compared it to every primate species in our database. And then I made the mistake of logging my results into the university's mainframe system." "What happened?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. 2 days later, men in suits showed up at my lab. They had documentation authorizing them to seize all my research materials related to the sample. They confiscated my notes, my data printouts, everything. Then they sat me down and explained, very calmly, very professionally, that I had never received any tissue sample from anyone, that any memory I had of analyzing unusual genetic material was a misunderstanding. that if I ever spoke about this to anyone, my career would be over, and my family would face consequences I didn't want to imagine. Patricia was crying now, something I'd never seen from this brilliant, composed woman. Walt, they knew things about my children, where they went to school, what time my husband leaves for work, the route my mother takes to church on Sundays. They weren't threatening me directly. They were just making sure I understood that they could. She left that night, and I never saw her again. 6 months later, I heard through academic channels that she'd taken a position at a university in New Zealand, abandoning her research program and her tenured position without explanation. The message was clear enough. Whatever I had stumbled onto, powerful people wanted it to stay buried. For weeks after Patricia's visit, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every car that drove past our house made me flinch. Every phone call that came at an odd hour sent my heart racing. I began keeping the remaining tissue samples in a hidden compartment I'd built into my workshop, behind a false panel I'd installed myself. Eleanor noticed the change in me. She was too smart not to. But she also knew better than to push when I wasn't ready to talk. She'd been with me through my worst nights after Vietnam, holding me when the nightmares came, never asking questions I couldn't answer. She extended me that same grace now, trusting that I would tell her when I could. The federal agents Harold had warned me about never came to my door. Part of me began to wonder if Patricia had been exaggerating, if her fear had amplified ordinary bureaucratic intimidation into something more sinister than it really was. I tried to return to my normal work, tracking elk populations and writing quarterly reports about forest health. But I couldn't stop thinking about those samples. Couldn't stop wondering what was out there in the vast wilderness that stretched from my doorstep to the Canadian border. In August of 1984, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. If the government wouldn't let me study these creatures through official channels, I would study them on my own, unofficially, quietly. Using all the skills I developed over 15 years as a field biologist to track and observe what I was increasingly certain was a surviving population of unknown hominids. I started with the location where the body had been found. The logging site had been shut down after the federal agent's visit, the company citing environmental concerns that had conveniently emerged after decades of clear-cutting in the area. The land was now off-limits, but I knew these forests better than most. I knew the old logging roads, the game trails, the routes that didn't appear on any map. On a cool Saturday morning in late August, I told Eleanor I was going to check on some camera traps I'd set up for a cougar study. Instead, I drove to a trailhead about 3 miles from the logging site and began hiking into country I'd never explored before. The forest in that region was different from the areas where I normally worked. The trees were older, some of them Douglas firs that had to be 500 or 600 years old, their trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. The canopy was dense enough that even at midday, the forest floor existed in a state of perpetual twilight. And it was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Any experienced wilderness worker knows the sounds of a healthy forest. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing, the constant background music of thousands of creatures going about their lives. This forest was silent in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked for 3 hours, documenting everything I saw. Game trails that seemed wider and more worn than they should be. Broken branches at heights of 8 or 9 feet, as if something tall had pushed through the undergrowth. And then, near a small creek that didn't appear on my topographical map, I found what I was looking for. Footprints. They were pressed into the soft mud at the water's edge, partially filled with water from the creek's recent rise. But they were still clear enough to measure. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the widest point, 5 distinct toe impressions, arranged in a pattern that was unmistakably humanoid, but scaled up to a size that no human could possess. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my camera and began photographing. The stride length between prints was nearly 5 feet, suggesting a creature moving at a casual walk. The depth of the impressions indicated a weight of at least 500 pounds, maybe more, and the direction of travel led deeper into the forest, away from any human habitation, into territory so remote that I doubted more than a handful of people had ever set foot there. I didn't follow the tracks that day. I wasn't prepared for an extended expedition, and something in my gut told me that I needed to be patient, that rushing into this would be dangerous, not just for me, but potentially for whatever was out there. I had spent my career studying wildlife, and if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that trust between species takes time to build. Predators and prey reach an understanding over generations. Even animals that tolerate human presence do so only after learning that we mean them no harm. Whatever these creatures were, they had survived by avoiding humans. They had developed hiding and evasion into an art form, remaining invisible to a species that prided itself on knowing everything. If I wanted to learn about them, I would need to earn their trust. And that meant showing them I was different from the humans who had hunted them, studied them, and buried their dead in shallow graves. The autumn of 1984 marked the beginning of what would become a 41-year obsession. I returned to that region of the forest every weekend, sometimes twice a week when my work schedule allowed. I mapped the area obsessively, marking locations where I found tracks, disturbed vegetation, or any other sign of unusual activity. I began leaving food at certain locations, apples mostly, along with dried fish and nuts. Things that a large, omnivorous primate might find appealing. The first winter was discouraging. Snow covered my study area from November through March, and I found few new signs of activity. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the previous months had caused me to see patterns where none existed. But in April of 1985, when the snow finally melted, I returned to one of my feeding stations and found something that made my heart stop. The apples I'd left were gone. Not rotted, not eaten by bears or deer, but taken. In their place, arranged in a neat pile on the flat rock where I'd left my offerings, were 3 large river stones, smooth and rounded by water. Stones that didn't occur naturally anywhere near that location. Something had taken my gift and left one in return. I spent the next several months refining my approach. I established a consistent schedule, visiting the same locations at the same times, leaving food and small gifts, always taking care to minimize any sign of my presence. I wore the same clothes every visit so that my scent would become familiar. I moved slowly and quietly, never making sudden movements or loud noises. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, I began to sense that I was being watched. The feeling is hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. A prickling awareness at the back of your neck, a certainty that something intelligent is observing you, evaluating you, deciding what to make of you. I never saw anything directly during that first year, but I found more tracks, more gifts left in exchange for my offerings, and occasionally, late in the day when the shadows grew long, I would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. Something large, moving between the trees with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. My first clear sighting came on September 3rd, 1986, nearly 2.5 years after I'd first analyzed those tissue samples. I remember the date because it was the day after Labor Day, and Eleanor and I had spent the holiday weekend visiting her parents in Portland. I'd been anxious the entire trip, eager to get back to my study area after a week away. That Tuesday afternoon, I hiked to a location I'd been visiting for months, a small meadow where I'd had consistent success with my feeding stations. The late summer sun was warm, filtering through the canopy in shafts of golden light. I'd brought a larger offering than usual, 2 pounds of dried salmon I'd purchased from a Native American fisherman near the Columbia River. I placed it on my usual rock and settled against a fallen log about 30 yards away, prepared for my typical routine of waiting and watching. I must have dozed off. The warmth and the quiet and the accumulated exhaustion of years of obsessive fieldwork caught up with me. When I opened my eyes, the sun had shifted, the shadows grown longer, and standing at the edge of the meadow, no more than 50 feet from where I sat, was a creature I will never forget as long as I live. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, probably more, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, like a professional football player scaled up by a factor of 2. Its body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, thick and matted in places, shorter and finer around the face and chest. The face itself was what struck me most. Not the face of an ape, not the face of a man, but something in between. A heavy brow ridge shadowed eyes that were watching me with an intensity that made my scientific detachment crumble into pure animal terror. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to flee, to get as far away from this impossible creature as my legs could carry me. But something else, something deeper than instinct, kept me rooted in place. The creature was not attacking. It was not displaying aggression. It was simply standing there, watching me with an expression that I can only describe as curious. Slowly, carefully, I raised both my hands, palms outward, the universal gesture of peaceful intention. The creature's head tilted slightly, a movement so human in its quality that it sent a chill down my spine. Then it did something that changed everything I thought I understood about what these creatures were. It mimicked my gesture, raised both of its massive hands, palms facing me, and held them there for several seconds before lowering them again. My voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. I've been leaving food for you. The dried fish, the apples. That was me." I knew it couldn't understand my words, not really, but I hoped the tone of my voice, calm and non-threatening, would communicate what language could not. The creature made a sound, low and rumbling, not quite a growl, but not quite a vocalization either. It reminded me of the sound a cat makes when it's thinking, a kind of contemplative noise that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Then it walked, actually walked upright like a human, to the rock where I'd left the salmon. It picked up the fish in one massive hand, brought it to its nose, and inhaled deeply. The sound it made then was different, approving almost, satisfied. It tucked the salmon under one arm and turned back toward the forest. But before it disappeared into the trees, it looked back at me one more time. And I swear I would stake my career on this. I saw something like recognition in its eyes, an acknowledgement that something had passed between us, a first tentative thread of connection. That night, I told Eleanor everything. I'd kept the secret for too long, and it was eating me alive. She listened without interruption as I described the tissue samples, Patricia's warning, my years of field research, and finally, the encounter I'd had that afternoon. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Walt, I've known something was going on since that day you came home in May of '84, looking like you'd seen a ghost. I didn't push because I trusted you. But I need to know, is this going to put our family in danger?" I thought about Patricia Okonkwo, about the men who had threatened her family, about the body that had been dug up and disappeared in the middle of the night. Yes, I said, it might. But I can't walk away from this. I found something real, something important, and if I don't document it, no one will ever know the truth. Eleanor reached across the table and took my hand. Then we'll be careful, she said, and you'll tell me everything from now on. No more secrets. That promise sustained me through the years that followed. Through the gradual deepening of my relationship with the creature I would come to call Solomon, for reasons I'll explain shortly. Through the threats and near discoveries and moments of profound connection that would reshape my understanding of what it means to be human. Through 4 decades of keeping a secret that grew heavier with each passing year, even as the bond I was building made it impossible to let go. The relationship between Solomon and me did not develop quickly or easily. Trust between different species is hard won, and trust between a human and a creature whose kind has been hunted and persecuted is harder still. But over the months and years that followed our first meeting, we established a routine that gradually evolved into something deeper. I visited the meadow twice a week, always on the same days and at the same times. I brought food, not just fish and fruit, but a variety of offerings designed to test what Solomon preferred and what he rejected. He liked smoked meats and dried berries. He was indifferent to bread and grains. He seemed fascinated by honey, which I started bringing in small jars that he would lick clean before returning them to the rock where I left my offerings. The returning of the jars was significant. It showed me that Solomon understood the concept of exchange, of reciprocity. He wasn't just taking what I offered. He was participating in a relationship, returning items that belonged to me, sometimes leaving gifts of his own. Interesting rocks, feathers from birds I couldn't identify, once a small pouch woven from plant fibers that contained what appeared to be dried herbs with a pleasant, medicinal smell. Our communication developed slowly. I began using consistent gestures to convey basic concepts. A hand raised in greeting, a palm pressed to my chest to indicate myself, a pointing motion to indicate direction or objects of interest. Solomon learned these gestures with startling speed and began using them back at me, along with his own additions that I struggled to interpret. By the spring of 1988, nearly 2 years after our first encounter, we had developed a vocabulary of perhaps 30 distinct gestures. Enough to communicate simple ideas. Enough for me to begin understanding who Solomon was and where he came from. The name Solomon came from a gesture he made frequently when we were together. He would touch the side of his head, then gesture toward the forest around us, a movement that seemed to indicate knowledge or wisdom about his environment. The first time I used the name aloud, pointing at him and saying Solomon, he made a sound that was almost like a laugh. Not mocking, but amused. As if the idea of a human naming him was both presumptuous and endearing. What I learned about Solomon over those early years filled me with wonder and heartbreak in equal measure. He was old, far older than I initially estimated. The gray in his fur, which I'd assumed indicated middle age, was actually a sign of advanced years. Through a complex series of gestures involving the rising and setting of the sun repeated many times, Solomon conveyed that he had lived through what I eventually calculated to be approximately 150 to 200 winters. 2 centuries of existence, hidden in these forests, watching human civilization encroach ever closer to his territory. Solomon had not always been alone. This was the hardest thing he communicated to me, through gestures that became increasingly agitated and distressed. He showed me, through pantomime and drawings scratched in the dirt, that he had once been part of a family group, a mate, children, others of his kind who had lived in these mountains for generations beyond counting. But they were gone now, taken or killed by humans over the decades. Solomon showed me scars on his body, long healed but still visible beneath his fur. Wounds from bullets, from traps, from the systematic violence that had reduced his people from a thriving population to scattered, terrified individuals hiding in the deepest wilderness. The body the logging crew had found in 1984, the one that had led me to this moment, had been Solomon's son. He had died from an infected wound suffered weeks earlier, and Solomon had buried him according to whatever customs his people observed for their dead. The federal agents had desecrated that grave, taken the body for study or disposal, left Solomon to grieve alone with not even a resting place to visit. When I understood this, when the full weight of what Solomon had endured became clear to me, I wept, sat right there in that meadow with this ancient, grieving creature watching me, and cried like I hadn't cried since I held dying boys in Vietnam. And Solomon, this being who had every reason to hate humans, who had watched us destroy everything he loved, crossed the distance between us for the first time and placed one massive hand on my shoulder. The gesture was unmistakable: comfort, understanding, an acknowledgement of shared sorrow across the vast gulf that separated our kinds. The late 1980s and early 1990s became a period of deepening connection between Solomon and me, even as the outside world grew increasingly dangerous for both of us. The Forest Service was restructuring, new management coming in with new priorities that emphasized recreation and tourism over conservation. I found myself fighting constantly to protect the areas where Solomon lived, inventing reasons to restrict access, filing reports about endangered species that didn't exist, doing everything in my power to keep humans away from his territory. Eleanor became my partner in this deception. She would cover for me when my absences became too frequent to explain, create alibis when colleagues asked questions, maintain the fiction that I was simply dedicated to my research rather than protecting an impossible secret. We had agreed early on that bringing anyone else into our confidence was too dangerous, but the strain of carrying this weight with only each other for support was immense. In 1991, we had a scare that nearly ended everything. A group of hikers stumbled into an area close to one of my feeding stations and reported seeing something they described as a giant ape. The local newspaper ran a story. Hunters began flooding into the region, and for 3 terrifying weeks, I didn't see any sign of Solomon. I thought he was gone, thought the exposure had finally driven him away, or worse, gotten him killed. But on a gray November morning, I found him waiting at our usual meeting spot, thinner than before, warier, but alive. He communicated something to me that day that I didn't fully understand until years later. A gesture toward the mountains, toward the deeper wilderness where no humans traveled. A questioning look. A hand extended toward me in what I eventually realized was an invitation. Solomon was asking me to come with him, to leave the human world behind and follow him into the hidden places where his kind still survived. It was the hardest refusal of my life. I had Eleanor, my career, my responsibilities. I couldn't simply vanish into the wilderness, no matter how much part of me wanted to. Solomon seemed to understand, or at least accept, my decision. But something changed between us after that. A sadness entered our interactions, an awareness that we existed in different worlds and could only meet in the narrow space where those worlds overlapped. The 1990s brought new technologies that both helped and complicated my research. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, and I eventually sent the remaining tissue samples to a private laboratory in Germany using false names and untraceable funding. The results confirmed what I'd suspected since 1984. A previously unknown hominid species, genetically distinct from humans but sharing approximately 97% of our DNA. Closer to us than chimpanzees, farther than anyone had imagined possible for a surviving undocumented species. I never published these findings. The memory of Patricia Okonkwo's terrified face was enough to keep me silent. But I documented everything in private journals, hoping that someday, after I was gone, the truth would come to light. Solomon aged during those years, though not visibly. His movements became slower, more deliberate. He slept more, sometimes dozing during our visits while I sat nearby, honored beyond words that he trusted me enough to be vulnerable in my presence. I was aging too. My hair went gray, then white. My knees began to ache after long hikes. Eleanor developed health problems that required more of my attention. But I never stopped visiting Solomon, never missed a scheduled meeting unless circumstances made it absolutely impossible. In 2003, something happened that tested every boundary of our relationship. Solomon became ill, more seriously ill than anything I'd witnessed in nearly 20 years of knowing him. He appeared at our meeting spot barely able to stand, his breathing labored, his fur matted with dried blood from a wound I couldn't immediately locate. "My God," I said, rushing toward him without thinking. "Solomon, what happened?" The wound was on his side, hidden beneath his arm. A gunshot wound, relatively fresh, still seeping. Someone had shot him, probably a hunter who had no idea what he was actually shooting at, or perhaps someone who knew exactly what they were aiming for. I was 70 years old that year, long past the age when I should have been making emergency decisions in remote wilderness. But I made a choice that would have been unthinkable in my younger, more cautious days. I brought Solomon to my home. Eleanor had passed away 2 years earlier, taken by the cancer we'd fought together for 3 brutal years. I lived alone now, in the same small house we'd shared for nearly 30 years. The isolation that had once felt like a burden became an asset. No neighbors close enough to see. No visitors expected. No one to witness me helping a wounded 8-foot creature into my barn. For 3 weeks, I cared for Solomon like a patient in a field hospital. I cleaned and dressed his wound, administered antibiotics I obtained through veterinary supply channels, kept him fed and hydrated while his ancient body fought to heal. He was delirious for the first few days, making sounds I'd never heard before, sometimes reaching out to touch my face as if confirming I was real. During those weeks of recovery, something shifted between us. The careful distance we'd maintained for years dissolved. Solomon began communicating with me more freely, sharing things he'd never shown me before. He traced drawings in the dirt floor of my barn, images that seemed to represent his history. His people, numerous ones, spread across the mountains, the coming of humans, the slow, systematic destruction of everything he'd known. And finally, the loneliness. A loneliness so profound that my own grief for Eleanor seemed small in comparison. Solomon was the last. He communicated this to me with a gesture I'd never seen before. A hand placed over his heart, then swept outward into empty space. There were no others, no family, no community, no future for his kind. He had lived for 2 centuries, watching his species dwindle and disappear until only he remained. A living artifact of a people who would soon exist only in memory. "I'm so sorry," I said, and the inadequacy of human language had never felt more absolute. Solomon made a sound that might have been acceptance or might have been despair. Then he did something he'd never done in all our years together. He reached out and pulled me into an embrace, his massive arms wrapping around me with surprising gentleness. I felt his heartbeat against my chest strong and slow, and I understood that for this moment, at least, neither of us was alone. He recovered from the wound, though he was never quite as strong afterward. I modified my barn to create a permanent shelter for him, a space where he could rest during the harsh winter months, instead of traveling to the more remote territories he'd used for years. Solomon accepted this arrangement with what I interpreted as gratitude, though he still disappeared for weeks at a time during the warmer seasons, returning to the deep wilderness that was his true home. Those final years were precious beyond description. We had moved past the careful protocols of researcher and subject into something I can only call friendship. Solomon would sometimes sit with me for hours, not communicating anything in particular, just sharing space the way old friends do. He seemed fascinated by human music, listening intently when I played recordings on a small portable player I'd brought to the barn. Classical music especially seemed to affect him, certain pieces by Bach or Mozart causing him to close his eyes and make soft sounds that might have been his species' equivalent of humming along. In the autumn of 2024, I turned 78. My own health was failing. The accumulated toll of decades spent hiking through difficult terrain and carrying secrets too heavy for one person. I had begun making arrangements, ensuring that my documentation would survive me. The journals, the photographs, the remaining genetic samples I'd kept hidden for 40 years. All of it organized, annotated, and stored in a secure location with instructions for its release after my death. Solomon noticed the change in me. He had always been attentive to subtle shifts in my condition, and he could see that I was slowing down, that my visits were becoming harder. One October evening, he communicated something to me that I struggled to understand at first. A gesture toward me, then toward the ground, then toward the sky, repeated several times with increasing emphasis. When I finally grasped his meaning, I sat down heavily on a hay bale and struggled to breathe. Solomon was asking about my death. He wanted to know when I would be going into the ground and then, according to whatever beliefs his people held, into the sky. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe soon, maybe not for years. But yes, eventually. His response was the most emotionally complex communication I'd received in 4 decades of knowing him. He touched his chest, then mine, touched the ground, then the sky. Then he did something I'd never seen. He made a sound that was unmistakably a word. One syllable, guttural, but clear. What he said, or as close as I can render it, was, "Wait. I'll wait, Solomon. As long as I can, I'll wait." For what? I wasn't sure. For his death or mine. For the end of our long, improbable friendship. For the extinction of his species, which would come when his ancient heart finally stopped beating. I visited Solomon for the last time on December 15th, 2024. The snow had come early that year, and my doctors had forbidden me from making the hike, but I went anyway, knowing somehow that this would be the end. He was waiting for me in the barn, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his once powerful frame diminished by age and illness. We sat together for several hours, not communicating anything in particular, just being present with each other, the way we'd learned to be over 40 years of careful, patient connection. When the light began to fade, Solomon did something extraordinary. He reached into the nest of blankets and straw where he slept and pulled out an object I recognized immediately. One of the original glass vials I'd received in 1984, the container that had held the tissue samples that started everything. Empty now, but unmistakable. He'd taken it from my workshop years ago, kept it hidden, and now he was giving it back. With it was something else. A lock of his own hair, carefully tied with plant fiber, placed inside the vial as if it belonged there. A gift. A piece of himself for me to keep. I took the vial with shaking hands. I don't know if I'll see you again, I said. Solomon touched his chest, then mine, then the sky. The gesture had become familiar. We'll meet there somehow. That was 4 weeks ago. I have not been back to the barn since. My body won't allow it, and I have accepted that our story has reached its conclusion. The documentation I've prepared will be released when I die, probably within the next few months. The genetic evidence, the photographs, the journals spanning 4 decades of observation. All of it will finally enter the public record, beyond the reach of whatever agencies tried to suppress this knowledge in 1984. I don't know what will happen to Solomon when I'm gone. Perhaps he'll return to the deep wilderness, live out his remaining days in the solitude he's known for so long. Perhaps he'll simply lie down one day and not get up, the last of his kind finally finding the rest he's been denied for 200 years. What I do know is this: they existed. They were real intelligent beings with complex emotions and rich inner lives. They loved and grieved and feared just as we do. They created art, developed language, built family structures that rivaled our own in their depth and meaning. And we destroyed them, not through ignorance, but through choice. We hunted them, captured them, drove them to the very edge of extinction. And when evidence of their existence emerged, we buried it, classified it, threatened anyone who tried to bring it to light. The governments of the world have known about these creatures for decades. They have tissue samples, bodies, genetic data that would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution. And they have kept it hidden because admitting the truth would mean admitting what we've done. It would mean acknowledging that humanity committed genocide against our closest relatives, that we wiped out beings who were, in every meaningful sense, people. I am 78 years old. I have lived with this knowledge for 41 years, and it has been the heaviest burden of my life. But I have also been privileged beyond measure. I have known Solomon, been trusted by him, loved by him in whatever way his species understood love. I have touched the impossible and found it more beautiful and more tragic than anything I could have imagined. If you take anything from this confession, let it be this: the world is larger and stranger than we know. There are mysteries hiding in the wild places, the last survivors of extinctions we have caused, watching us from the shadows, afraid to show themselves because they know what we do to things we don't understand. Solomon taught me that intelligence and compassion are not unique to humans, that connection can transcend species and circumstance, and all the barriers we think separate us from the rest of the natural world. And he taught me that the greatest sin is not ignorance, but the refusal to see what's right in front of us. I am dying now, and I am at peace with that. But I hope, with whatever time I have left, that telling this story might change something, that someone, somewhere, might look at the wild places differently, might protect rather than exploit, might choose wonder over fear. Solomon is waiting for me. In this world, or whatever comes next, I believe we'll find each other again. And when we do, I hope I'll finally have the words to thank him for everything he showed me about what it means to be alive. The samples are real. The evidence exists. And now, at last, the world will know the truth that has been hidden for far too long.